Today's reading is from Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Jesus told them several other stories to illustrate the kingdom, he said. The kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a king who prepared a great wedding feast for his son. Many guests were invited, and when the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to notify everyone that it was time to come, but they all refused. So he sent other servants to tell them, "The feast has been prepared, and choice meats have been cooked. Everything is ready. Hurry!" But the guests he had invited ignored them and went about their business, one to his farm, another to his store. Others seized the messengers and treated them shamefully, even killing some of them. Then the king became furious. He sent out his army to destroy the murderers and burn their city. And he said to his servants, "The wedding feast is ready, and the guests I invited aren't worthy of the honor. Now go out to the street corners and invite everyone you see." So the servants brought in everyone they could find, good and bad alike, and the banquet hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to meet the guests, he noticed a man who wasn't wearing the proper clothes for a wedding. "Friend," he asked, "how is it that you are here without wedding clothes?" And the man had no reply. Then the king said to his aides, "Bind him hand and foot, and throw him out into the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen."
Thank you, Kirk. Welcome again this morning. This parable, I think, is one of the most challenging. If you, like I am, contend that God is in himself nonviolent, that God, some people go as far to say that God asks us to not be violent. He asks us to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile. But that ultimately God will become very violent with people at the final judgment. So this parable can validate that second way of thought. It can be read in such a way that it sees the king as the God figure in the parable, and that ultimately God is going to get his anger poured out again, even though it's difficult because in that whole system of thought, supposedly God got his anger dealt with Jesus on the cross. But anyway, that's where we are, and you guys have probably read that parable or heard it taught in that way. So this is the fifth message in this series of 5 parables from Matthew's lectionary readings in this lectionary year. So we've considered already the unforgiving servant, the laborers in the vineyard, and then the last 3, the 2 sons, the wicked tenants, and the wedding banquet. Jesus tells all of those 3 in Matthew's narrative in response to 2 questions that the chief priests and elders ask him. And the questions are asked the day after Jesus did his famous temple protest, where he went into the temple, turned over the tables, drove out the money changers, and drove out the sacrificial animals. So what was he doing there? He was protesting not just some religious thing. He does say at the end, "My Father's house should be a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves." But we have to, like we did a couple of weeks ago, think about what was the temple. The temple was a massive structure built and funded to a large degree by Herod. It began with Herod the Great before Jesus was born. But he did this in agreement with the Jewish religious leaders, saying that he would get the naming rights for this temple. Just like when sports teams build a new stadium in the United States, they take bids on which company will get to name the stadium after themselves. So that's why all of these stadiums around the United States have corporate names. They have corporate sponsors. This is the same thing that happened with the temple, the second temple, is that Herod got to name it. Herod was a real estate developer turned politician who liked to build big, opulent buildings and put his name on them. Wow, this is very relevant to today. So this is what Jesus was protesting. He was protesting this whole arrangement, this whole collusion between the Jewish people and Roman political power, political establishment. We could learn a lot from Jesus' protest in the temple. And whenever somebody protests the ruling class, there is always pushback. And that's what happens in this question, that the elders and the chief priests, these guys were the ones that had the leadership of the temple, and they asked Jesus, by whose authority are you doing this, and who gave you this authority? They're all consumed with authority, or in other words, questions of order, keeping the status quo, keeping things lined up, all their ducks in a row, the way they've created them to be. And it was a delicate balance of power, because typically when Rome went into a region and conquered it, they wouldn't allow the continued worship of the local gods. But they had this delicate balance where they could continue to worship in the temple, continue to offer sacrifices the way they always had. But it was in this weird arrangement, this collusion with political power. So they asked Jesus, what's up? Who gives you the authority to do this? Who are you to do this thing anyway? And who gave you that authority? And then Jesus tells these three parables in answer to that question: the two sons, the wicked tenants, and the wedding banquet. Today we're at the last one, the wedding banquet parable, which is the most problematic from the viewpoint of those of us who think that God himself is nonviolent, not just that he tells us to be nonviolent. In other words, I don't think we serve a do as I say, not as I do God. I think God doesn't ask us to do anything more than he does and demonstrated in his own son, Jesus. So here's just a quick summary of this parable. Jesus begins it with this statement: the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who made a wedding feast for his son. Number 2, slaves are sent to invite guests to the banquet, but the guests don't come. Number 3, more slaves are sent to implore the guests to come. They neglect the invitation, and some of them beat and kill the king's slaves. So not all of the people that were invited do this, but some of them are quite hostile toward the invitation carriers. Number 4, the king was enraged and sent his soldiers to destroy the murderers and burn down their city. And 5, the king sends slaves to invite everyone. People respond and fill the wedding hall, which, after you've gone through and killed everybody and burned a city, people may be thinking, I better respond to the invitation now, right? Those that are left over. And then number 6, one man attends without a wedding garment, and the king orders him to be tied up and thrown into outer darkness. So my first question is, does this king act like Jesus acted in his ministry in those 3 or 3.5 years that he functioned in Galilee? No, we don't see Jesus acting like this king at all, do we? And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and I only do what I see my Father doing. So this raises a question. Does this king sound like the Abba, the father of Jesus? I'd say no, it doesn't sound like him. When Jesus' disciples, remember, wanted to call down fire on a Samaritan village for not receiving Jesus, which is very similar to this denial of an invitation, his disciples wanted to act this way. His disciples wanted to act like the king in this parable, but Jesus rebuked them for that. Says, you don't know what spirit you're of when you think that way, when you think that we should destroy people that resist us or don't invite us or don't respond to our invitation. Jesus never acted like the king in this parable, either before, during, or after his death. But the parable begins like this: the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. Some translations say the kingdom of heaven is like or can be likened to. I think the word compared is better because of this. Comparison does not imply likeness. Comparison does not imply similarity. I can compare a water fountain to a go-kart, but that does not suggest that they have any similarities. Right? But even beyond that, let's talk about what is the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. They're basically interchangeable. We tend today to think of the kingdom of heaven as a fourth dimensional place in which is where God dwells with the angels, and where Christians that have died and gone on, reside with God. Or we can think of it as a kind of a perfect kind of government, because we especially here have recognized that Jesus says the kingdom is at hand. He didn't want us to think of the kingdom solely as some afterlife place or some fourth dimensional existence. He wanted us to think of the kingdom as being here and now. Whenever the will of God was done in Jesus' ministry, he would say, the kingdom has come close to you. The kingdom has come near. So there is a here and now aspect to the kingdom. But the Jews would not have thought, especially in the context of this question, these two questions, when they're questioning Jesus about authority because of the protest he'd just done, they would not have been thinking, when Jesus told this parable, about the afterlife. Follow what I'm saying? They were concerned with, what are you doing? You're disrupting our temple and our religious and political practices. Who gives you the authority to do this? If Jesus came back with, well, let me tell you about something that's going to happen over 2,000 years from now after the resurrection and the last judgment, they would have not at all understood what he was talking about. You follow me? So we kind of have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that are asking the question to put some blinders on our interpretive horizon, right? I don't think we ought to think of this, and it's very easy to slip into, oh, Jesus, a wedding banquet, he must be talking about the great marriage supper of the Lamb or something. I'm saying, no, let's not do that. Let's not allow ourselves to spiritualize this too much, because Jesus was telling this in answer to a very important here and now question about his authority. So, when we're thinking of the kingdom of heaven and how the religious leaders would have thought about the kingdom of heaven at this time, 2,000 years ago, we only have to look back a few verses in Matthew 21 to the parable we just talked about last week, the parable of the wicked tenants. At the end of that parable, Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing or marvelous in our eyes. Then verse 43 is really interesting. He says, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. So Jesus is acknowledging in this statement that the chief priests and elders already had the kingdom of God. They were already in charge of the kingdom of God. That the kingdom of God, to the audience that he was speaking of, was basically the nation of Israel. They saw themselves as God's kingdom on earth. So whenever Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, I think we need to keep that in mind and resist the idea that Jesus is talking now about some ideological, perfect kind of kingdom, either in the afterlife or here and now on earth. Because Jesus, right in his own words, acknowledges that the kingdom of God was already present on earth, even before he showed up, and that the rulers of Israel had charge of it. But in answering these questions about authority, he's telling them, you guys have not kept up. You guys have not understood what it means to be in charge of God's kingdom on earth. Therefore, it's going to be taken from you and given to a people who do understand how God's kingdom is supposed to operate. So this means Jesus didn't come to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. He came to teach us what the kingdom is supposed to look like on earth. He did exactly that whenever he fed the hungry, healed the sick, delivered the oppressed, raised the dead, or spoke truth to corrupt power. So how did Jesus describe the kingdom of heaven in first century Israel? All of this is kind of to get us to understand how Jesus thought of the kingdom of heaven in first century Israel, how the leaders of the Jews thought about the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says this really interesting statement also in Matthew 11:12. It says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. I think this is a very often misunderstood verse. If you've been around charismatic circles, you've heard all kinds of wacky ideas about what they think this verse means. But I think we ought to read it just for what it says. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence. It doesn't inflict violence, it suffers it. The kingdom of heaven is warred against, and it causes suffering for those in it. And violent people try to take the kingdom of heaven by force. The kingdom of heaven then never causes suffering, but it does endure suffering. Violent people inflict suffering on the kingdom of heaven, but the kingdom of heaven never inflicts suffering on violent people. Everybody with me? So we have to keep in mind that the kingdom of heaven is not some far-off distant reality. It is a here and now reality, and even Jesus understood it as really being the government of Israel at the time and before he even showed up. So I think we need to understand or look for a different way to understand the parable of the wedding banquet than thinking that God is the king who inflicts suffering on wedding guests that don't respond to his invitation. Because the kingdom suffers violence, it doesn't inflict violence. Everybody following me? The kingdom of heaven is the victim of violence. It does not victimize other people with violence. That tells me right off that maybe the way we've typically understood this parable, as God is the king, inflicting violence on other people, might be not the best way to understand it. We need to find a different way to understand what's happening also to the man who comes to the banquet without a wedding garment. Perhaps even a different way to understand who this unrobed man is. The wedding banquet is often thought to represent the marriage supper of the Lamb after the general resurrection, but I don't see any reason to think that the chief priests and the elders would have thought this. They weren't talking about the afterlife when they asked him questions of authority. They were talking about, how come you can bust down our temple and do all of this now, here and now? The parable is often understood this way, too. The God is the king figure who invites people everywhere to the marriage supper of the Lamb in the afterlife. Some people reject that offer, that invitation, and are sent to hell forever. Other people don't see this as an afterlife parable, but as a parable about what's to come in AD 70. You know, that this is Jesus prophesying about the destruction of Israel in AD 70. An unrobed man or a man not wearing a wedding garment comes in. Man, there's all kinds of conjecture in commentaries about what does that man represent and who is this man. Some propose that wedding garments were supplied by the host in these ancient wedding ceremonies, and that if you came into a ceremony and didn't don the apparel that the host had provided for you, it was a show of disrespect. There actually is very little historical evidence for that view. It's one of those views that kind of runs around the church and pastors spout it, but I've found very little historical evidence that may be the case. Some consider the robe as righteousness or respect for the king. In any case, things don't end well for that guy. He's bound and cast out into outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. I don't think any of those understandings of this parable make sense in light of how Jesus treated people. And they don't comport with how Jesus spoke of his Father. And they don't agree with Jesus' statement in the same gospel that the kingdom suffers violence, it does not inflict violence. So where does that leave us? Last week when we considered the parable of the wicked tenants, I presented it as both a history lesson and a prophecy. I think we can approach this parable the same way, that there is some elements of history in it and there is an element of prophecy in it as well. Let me tell you a story first. Once upon a time, there was a greedy old man named Phil who paid his employees barely enough to get by on. He loved his money and he hated to part with any of his money. One of his employees, named Jim, had a young son who was very sick and needed medical attention. But since greedy Phil didn't like to provide health insurance for his employees, the young boy was actually near death. Jim begged his boss on occasion for a day off to go and care for his son, but Phil wouldn't give him any time off, showed him no compassion for his son. But at night, greedy Phil was plagued by nightmares, tormented in his sleep. Ghosts would come to him in the night and show him visions of terrible things in his past, in his present, and in his future. He'd begged the ghosts to leave him alone, but they wouldn't. Night after night, these nightmares continued and continued. And one morning, though, after seeing a particularly horrible future for him, Phil woke up a changed man. And he ran over to Jim's house where Jim's sick son was near death and took the boy to the hospital and says, heal the boy, I'll pay all of his medical expenses. Now, does this story sound familiar, vaguely familiar to anybody here? A little bit familiar, yeah. It's very similar to Dickens' A Christmas Carol, isn't it? Some of the details are different, but there's enough similarity in the story that you can recognize the storyline, the plot line, right? We could call this a trope. A trope is and sometimes that's used negatively. I'm not using it that way today. If you look up common movie tropes or story tropes, you'll find that there are only a few basic plot lines to almost all the movies we see. You know, they change the names and they change the circumstances and stuff, but it's a plot device, a common plot device. I'm going to propose that in this parable, Jesus was constructing a story that would have immediately sounded familiar to the chief priests and the elders. Some of the details were different, but they would have known immediately what Jesus was talking about, even if some of the details didn't match the actual events that they were familiar with. This story that Jesus was constructing had roots in actual historical events in the not too distant past. This is why the chief priests and elders would have known what Jesus was talking about. But today, we're far removed from the events that Jesus was alluding to in this parable. This doesn't mean that we don't have access to this history, though. So I'm going to present a radically different interpretation of this parable than the ones we've talked about so far. And I'm leaning a lot on a paper by Marty Aiken of Yale University in this different reading today. And here's an outline of it. The story is a trope. That's my word for Marty doesn't call it that, but I'm going to characterize it that way because Jesus, I think, and what Aiken is promoting is telling a story, changing some of the names, changing some of the details, but the listeners in the first century would have immediately recognized what Jesus was talking about. Number two, like we've talked about, it is one of Jesus' answer to the questions about his authority. So we have to keep that in mind. That, I think, will keep us grounded in the here and now, and we won't get too far afield in our theological musings about this parable. Like, oh, this isn't an afterlife story or something like that. Number three, Aiken proposes that the king is not an allusion to God, but it is an allusion to Herod the Great. This is the Herod the Great that built the temple that Jesus was just protesting in, right? So this is intriguing because Jesus had just done this protest in this temple that bore Herod's name, and then he tells a parable, and Aiken proposes that he's telling a parable about the builder of this temple. So he's going to propose, and we'll talk about it, that the king is actually Herod the Great. That the city that was destroyed in this parable was actually Jerusalem in its destruction, not in AD 70, but in 37 BCE. Herod the Great actually rode into Israel and burned the city and with the Roman soldiers killed many, many people before Jesus was born, 37 years BCE. And he proposes that the man without a garment is in fact Jesus. Let me read just a little bit from his introduction because this can be hard to get your head around. He says, I want to caution the reader to be aware of the enormous inertial pull of the accepted reading. He's talking about the reading where the king is God and so forth. Gravity is the effect one body exerts on another, and the accepted reading has acquired such mass that it almost transforms Jesus' words in Matthew's text into a black hole that pulls into itself any attempt to read the parable differently. So we're going to have to work to think about this parable differently, is what I'm saying. And he recognizes that in his right in his introduction in his paper. We're going to have to be willing to think differently about this. Okay, so we've talked about Herod the Great in this series a bit more in his relationship with the temple. He was a Roman client king just before Jesus was born. He was dead at this point. The time when Jesus is telling his parable, Herod had died in, I think, 4 A.D. or somewhere right around, just after Jesus was born. Herod the Great was visited by the wise men and sought to have Jesus killed. Remember when in the Christmas story? Herod the Great died soon after Jesus was born, and his son, Herod Antipas, was now the tetrarch, or the functional king of Galilee. He had 2 other sons that actually were tetrarchs in that region as well, and a daughter that had an area that she was in charge of. But before any of that had happened, before he got involved with the temple, before Herod even came to Israel, Antigonus was the Hasmonean king in Judea. This is going back 40 BCE, 40 years before Christ, basically. The Hasmonean line or the Hasmonean dynasty began with, I think it was the brother of Judas Maccabeus. We've talked about Judas Maccabeus about 140 years before Jesus. Remember, the temple had been taken over by the Seleucids. Judas Maccabeus was a zealot who gathered a group of people and rode in and drove the Seleucids out, reclaimed the temple. So Maccabeus was kind of a hero to the Jewish people. He had reclaimed the temple that had been corrupted and defiled by the Seleucids. So I think it wasn't Judas Maccabeus himself, it was either his father or his brother or son, started this Hasmonean empire. And the lineage then, from that point on, when Maccabeus reclaimed the temple, down to this time, now when Herod the Great was, before he'd come to Jerusalem, Hasmonean kings had been elected. It was sort of a family affair, right? So like many empires, rulers are chosen from royal families, and one after another, for 160 years, Hasmoneans had been in charge of Judah. They were particularly violent rulers to a great extent. But in 63 BC, the Romans conquered the region. The Romans came in there and they conquered it. Antigonus, though, at the time bribed his way into leadership and was the last king in the Hasmonean dynasty. So this is the history part of this parable. We don't put you to sleep with it. But in 39 BCE, Rome named Herod the Great the king of the Jews, while Antigonus was still king in Israel. So Herod was not a Hasmonean. Herod was the beginning of the Herodian dynasty that you read about in history. So even though in 39 BC the Romans named Herod the king of the Jews, he was not then immediately put on the throne. They didn't really give him any help with that. And Antigonus was still the ruler in Judea. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So Herod then assembles a contingent of Roman soldiers and he goes to Jerusalem. So he has the power of Rome with him. He goes up to Jerusalem. He's opposed by the Jewish forces at the walls of the city, but instead of setting his soldiers into battle against Antigonus, he tries to make a deal. And Josephus, a historian, wrote that Herod came for the good of the people and for the preservation of the city. So Herod wasn't interested in destroying the city in order to gain his kingship of it. And rather than storming the city, he made an invitation to Antigonus. He says, I come for the good of the people and the preservation of the city. And what's really interesting about this is Herod was in fact engaged to be married to the granddaughter of the high priest at the time, who was a Hasmonean. So Herod is about to be married. And he goes to the walls of Jerusalem and invites them to be a part of this marriage, the marriage of really two empires, the Hasmonean Empire and now the Herodian Empire that was just about to begin. Everybody following me so far? This woman that he was engaged to was Marianne. She was the granddaughter of the high priest in Jerusalem, was a Hasmonean. So Herod was engaged to be married to a Hasmonean Jew, same family as Antigonus. This is the same kind of marriage that have often taken place to bridge divides between powerful political families. Right? We read about these often. When there's a rival political families or rival dynasties, often they'll have a marriage between two people in those different dynasties to bring unity, to combine those two kingdoms. But Antigonus turns down this offer. So Herod comes with this offer, an offer to have a wedding unite these two kingdoms. Or Antigonus refuses the invitation to the wedding banquet that King Herod was inviting him to. So it wasn't specifically in all the details the same thing as Jesus is telling this parable, but remember, we're thinking metaphorically today, okay? A banquet that would have united the Herodians and the Hasmoneans, but with Herod named King of the Jews. All of these things Achan proposes would have come to mind when Jesus said he sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. At this point, Herod could have become very angry. They turned down my invitation and stormed the city. He could have then installed himself as king. He had the blessing of Rome behind him and married Marianne. But he doesn't do that. Herod had hoped that Antigonus and the Jews inside Jerusalem would accept his invitation to his wedding banquet, a wedding between one of their own, a Hasmonean, and himself, but they refuse. And some of the people from within the walls of Jerusalem begin harassing and attacking the Roman soldiers that are with Herod from inside the walls. That may have also brought this statement of Jesus brought this to mind when Jesus said, "But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them." So Josephus records that some Jews did go over to Herod's side and even joined with the Roman soldiers. But even as the Jews were attacking Herod's troops from inside the walls, surprisingly, Herod takes his soldiers and leaves. At this point, he doesn't do anything in retaliation. But he's not gone long, and when he returns, he makes no offer like he did before. He doesn't come bearing an invitation this time, but the soldiers immediately begin raising mounds and, what do they call them, bulwarks, structures. You know how they would attack walled cities is they would build earthen structures up against the walls so they could climb up those structures. Sometimes they were wooden structures up against the walls. Usually they'd find the lowest point in the part in the wall they thought was most vulnerable. They'd build some kind of a structure there so that they could gain access over the walls into the city. So Herod goes away, then he comes back, and his soldiers immediately go to work preparing for battle. But while the soldiers are building these structures, Herod leaves. And where does he go? He goes to Samaria and marries Marianne. So not far, but he goes away and he marries the Hasmonean granddaughter of the high priest. The wedding banquet takes place, but the Jews inside the city who had been invited don't attend. Herod's offer of reconciliation had been rejected, so he invited others to his wedding. And others came. They came to his wedding, but in Samaria, not in Jerusalem. Jesus puts it like this: "Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet." Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. After Herod's wedding, he returns then to Jerusalem, and then he gives the order for his soldiers to take the city. Josephus writes of this battle, "Herod made an assault upon the city and took it by storm, and now all parts were full of those that were slain by the rage of the Romans and the zeal of the Jews that were on Herod's side. So they were murdered continually in the narrow streets and in the houses and by crowds, and as they were flying to the temple for shelter, and there was no pity taken on either infants or the aged nor the weaker sex." Jesus says in this parable, the king was enraged, he sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. So as this siege is taking place, Antigonus, remember the ruler of the current ruler of Israel, the Hasmonean ruler, comes down from his citadel and he surrenders himself to Herod, and he pleads for mercy for himself and for the people. He's arrested and he's bound, put into bonds. In the parable, Jesus says, "But when the king came to see the guests, he noticed a man who was not wearing a wedding robe, and he said, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless, and the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" So Antigonus, who had refused Herod's initial invitation, now stands defenseless, pleading for his people. And what does Herod do? Herod pays tribute, or he pays money. Tribute's another name for a bribe, basically. He pays money you give somebody to get them to do something. He pays tribute to Antony, another Roman authority, to have Antigonus executed. Herod spared the temple. He was a half Jew, by the way, and he wanted to be seen, I think, as a legitimate king. Even though he had been named king of the Jews by Rome, he wanted to be seen as a legitimate ruler. I think that's why he made this invitation in the first place. It was only after Antigonus refused and forced his hand that he came back and stormed the city. So the parable up to this point we can think of as history. All of these things that Jesus says in the parable, Achan contends, would have brought these recent events to mind for the chief priests and the elders, because they were all tied up in this Hasmonean family. They're all in that same lineage, right? Not all of them, but some of them are. So even though they weren't, some were in power, it got mixed up with the Pharisees, the Sadducees at this point. But Achan's contending that as Jesus constructs this parable, a lot of bells would have been going off in their mind, remembering these events that happened just within a generation or so before this. At this point, it really switches to prophecy, though, because this unrobed man could be seen as Antigonus, historically speaking. The man without a wedding garment could maybe be seen as him. He'd lost his authority at that point. He's lost his ability to resist Herod at that point. He was not going on. He wasn't putting on the wedding garment that Herod had proposed and offered to him. So we could see it historically, but we can also see this unrobed man as Jesus. And that at this point in the parable, Jesus switches from history, reminding them of events that led them to this place. And now he's starting to prophesy about some events that will happen in the very near future, just in the next few days. In a few days, it would be Jesus who would have his robe stripped from him. It would be Jesus who was led to slaughter and like a sheep didn't open his mouth. In the parable, Jesus says the man doesn't say anything. He's speechless. The king asks him, how'd you get in here without a wedding garment? And the man doesn't respond. This is a tactic Jesus took before Pilate. It would be Jesus disrobed, weeping and gnashing his teeth as he was being scourged. It was Jesus who was cast into the outer darkness of death by the king. This is Isaiah's suffering servant that we read about in Isaiah 52 and 3. And then Marty Aiken makes these observations. Now, I have several slides I'll just read through so you can follow along. If the man without a wedding garment is in fact a reference to the suffering servant, then the suffering servant has put us in a position to understand the answer Jesus gave to the chief priests and elders. The chief priest actually asked Jesus two questions. The first was, by what authority are you doing these things? The answer, probably different from any answer they had conceived of, was the authority of the suffering servant. The priests and a great many others expected Jesus to lead a revolution. Jesus now tells them that instead of a revolution, he will take onto himself the violence that already rules their lives. Jesus' answer that he will suffer their violence leads us naturally to their next question, as their own anxious calculating had led the priests to asking it. They ask, who gave you this authority? The answer is one of the great insights and one of the great ironies of the gospel. The answer is, you did, and you are, by virtue of the persistence of the violence you have practiced since the foundation of the world, and which you intend for me, Jesus, now. The suffering servant receives his authority by taking onto himself the violence, the sins, and the suffering of others. He is called into being by a broken world. So, let's just review these points. We can this reading of the parable kind of considers it a trope, or a story that's told to remind them of another story. Not exactly the same in all the details, but like I did with my concocted story that reminded you of A Christmas Carol, Jesus could have been telling a story, constructing a parable that would have reminded them of something in their very recent history, of how they got to this place that they were in, which Jesus had just protested the day before, and they were objecting to. In these questions about authority. And then number 3, the king then, rather than being a God figure, would be an allusion to Herod the Great. The city destroyed was Jerusalem, which had been destroyed just about, at this point, 60, 70 years prior to when Jesus was telling this parable. And the man without the garment then, rather than some disrespectful outcast, is in fact Jesus. Okay. What do you think? Is this reading of the parable more or less problematic than the traditional reading? Does it solve some problems, and does it create some problems? You can think of it that way. Does it make sense that in response to the leaders questioning Jesus about his authority, that he would have told them a story about some post-mortem fourth-dimensional heaven? I don't think so. I think we can push that one off the table. I think we tend to, whenever we hear about wedding banquets and stories like that, we tend to jump to the conclusion, oh, Jesus is telling a story about the afterlife. I think we can safely say, no, he wasn't doing that here. It would have made no sense at all to the people that were listening to him. And it's not to say that sometimes Jesus' answers left people befuddled. Sometimes they did. But I don't think he intentionally did that. I think he did it because he would say, you who have ears to hear, let him hear. Right? So he whenever he had told a parable or something like that, he knew that some people would get it and some wouldn't. He was asked about why his disciples asked him, why do you teach in parables, teacher? He said, so that some will understand and some won't. Right? So he knows that, but I don't think that he would intentionally tell a parable that he knew nobody would understand. And if we make this about the afterlife, I think it would be that. There's no way they would be thinking about that he's talking about some marriage supper of the Lamb in the afterlife. They just didn't, that wasn't on their radar at all. They were concerned about, why are you doing this? And they were concerned that he was going to bring the wrath of the Romans down on them. Right? And in keeping in mind Matthew 11:12, that the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, it doesn't inflict it, and violent people try to take it by force, which is exactly what they tried to do by killing Jesus. Okay.